Welcome to the next generation in chelated minerals. Introducing new Keysure Plus amino acid chelated minerals from Balchem. Keysure Plus delivers a higher concentration of mineral with a superior amino acid profile. The higher mineral content adds formulation flexibility, opening up space in the ration, and also reduces the carbon footprint. The superior amino acid profile delivers 28% protein from microbial biomass. The Keysure Plus line also offers a granulated form for improved handling characteristics and reduced dust. Visit balchem.com to see how new Keysure Plus can deliver the added benefits you need to improve performance and reduce manufacturing hurdles.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. My name is Kim Jones, a member of the marketing team with Balchem. Today, we welcome Dr. Mike VandeHaar, Michigan State University, to take a deep dive into short stature corn hybrids and what we know about their impact on lactating cows. Mike has been a professor of dairy nutrition at Michigan State University since 1988, is internationally recognized for his expertise in dairy cattle feed efficiency, and teaches nutrition and mammary physiology. Mike is actively involved in the American Dairy Science Association and currently serves as its president. His research focuses on improving feed efficiency, reducing methane emissions, and sustainably feeding people. He led the multi-state project that added the Feed Saved trait to the U.S. Net Merit Index, guiding the selection of more efficient cows. He also studies calf and heifer nutrition, late lactation feeding strategies, and energy metabolism, and contributed to the 2021 revision of the nutrient requirements of dairy cattle for the National Academies. Mike, welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. The floor is now yours.
One thing, though, I'm no longer the president of ADSA. I am a past president, which is actually nice. It took a lot
Giving
of time.
you some more time to do things like this. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll switch to, there we go. Can you see my slides?
They're coming up right now. There we go. Yes, we can.
Okay. So I'll just start with this preface. Corn silage is not necessarily my expertise. I've done corn silage study before, so this is my second one. Energy metabolism is my expertise, and the energy chapter in the new NASM was Bill Weiss and I worked hard on that one together. And feed efficiency is something I'm very interested in. So this is a study that we did a couple of years ago. Just kind of happened to be at the same place as a group of folks from DeKalb at the same time. I met them, and they were interested in they were talking about short corn, and I asked them more about it, and I thought that sounds like something I'd like to do a study on. So I'd like to just acknowledge my collaborators at MSU. Estathios Sarmakosoglu is a postdoc with me from Greece, and Riley Barber is a master's student. And then I'd like to acknowledge Bayer Crop Science for their support of the study. And the short hybrids we'll talk about are theirs. So I want to start off with why I care about this, and that is that there's really no question about it. If you can get more milk from a cow, almost always she will be more efficient at using feed. If a cow produces only a little bit of milk, almost all of her feed is used for maintenance. And over the last 100 years, we've increased feed efficiency dramatically because our cows now produce about 11,000 kilos or 23,000 pounds per year compared to about 4,000 pounds per cow per year 100 years ago. And a lot of that has been due to breeding and genetics, but nutritionists have had to, and other management specialists have had to keep up with the cows that we have. Okay, so as cows eat more and produce more per day, the proportion of their feed used for maintenance is diluted out by the proportion converted to product. Okay, so I want to feed diets that allow cows to eat as much as possible of the diet so they can produce more milk. And a key to that is to balance fiber and starch. Fiber is needed for rumen health, and I'm sure most of you listening to this already know this, right? Fiber is needed for rumen health, but too much fiber can increase rumen fill and decrease feed intake and consequently milk production. And one way to look at it is we could put fiber concentration as NDF, neutral detergent fiber, on the x-axis. And as you go from extremely high fiber to very low fiber, you'll see that feed intake increases, and then it can dramatically decrease if you don't have enough fiber. And energy intake is increasing too, because you're feeding not only a more energy dense diet, but the cows can eat more of it. And then forage fiber is generally more filling than non-forage fiber. So corn silage, alfalfa, that fiber is more filling and takes longer to ferment and get out of the system than do most non-forage fiber byproduct feeds. And forages with greater fiber digestibility enable greater intake and milk production with less risk of ruminal acidosis than high starch diets. So one way to look at that, this is a table that was in the NASM 2021, I think in the carbohydrate chapter. So table 5.1. And you can see that the minimum forage NDF content on the left side there, and then here's maximal starch and minimum total NDF. And the point I want to make is that if we have a lot of forage NDF, we can have more starch. If we have less forage NDF, we can't usually put as much starch in the diet, and we need to have more non-forage NDF in the diet. In Michigan, we love to feed corn silage. We often feed diets that are very high in starch. Corn silage provides both the forage NDF and the starch. So feeding a 19-20% forage NDF diet along with 30 to even 33-34% starch is pretty common. I know that in other parts of the country, things are done differently. And in later lactation, I also am interested, this is for the peak cows, and then later lactation, I'm also interested in feeding a little less starch so that I partition nutrients toward milk instead of body fat. So, and I think about how to feed a cow through the lactation cycle, and we will get back to this when we think about corn silage hybrids. Around parturition, my goal is just worrying about optimal health. If I don't have maximal milk, that's fine. I want to make sure the rumen is healthy, the cow gets off to a healthy start on her lactation. Once you get to about 3 weeks into lactation, typically the cow is taking off, and now I'm going to worry about maximal milk, and I want to get her bred. Once she's bred, I still want maximal milk, but I want to have her in optimal body condition. So to think about how to do that, the first thing to think about is what are the things that limit how much a cow can eat? Around transition, we think that it's probably metabolic fuels, but during the peak of lactation and at least half of lactation, intake is limited mostly by gut distension. So how much stuff is in the rumen is what determines how much she can eat. And what I just talked about, forage NDF is especially filling. That's when we really worry about how much forage NDF and how digestible is that forage NDF. If I can have less forage NDF or forage NDF that's more digestible, typically the cow can eat more. So how do I feed a cow? I want to feed her minimum fiber during this peak lactation with high starch, because high starch enables her to eat more. And then when I get to later lactation, I'd rather feed lower starch, because starch promotes partitioning toward body fat. So I want to have less partitioning toward body fat. But I would love to have digestible fiber throughout the lactation, except for maybe I don't worry about it as much in the very start. High crude protein and rumen undegraded protein early on. I can feed less protein and RUP later on. Different fats throughout the lactation, expensive supplements than cheap feeds. But what I really want to think about today is fiber and digestible fiber and forage NDF. So to do that, before we get into short corns, My colleague, Mike Allen, who was well known for his work on corn silage, BMR, factors that influence feed intake. That was really what his career was based on, is factors that influence feed intake. Did a study in the late 1990s, published in 2000, that showed the value of BMR corn silage. Okay, they had only a few cows in a Latin square design, but what they did was they fed a BMR corn silage versus a control corn silage at 2 levels of starch. So one was very high starch, 37% starch, 29% NDF, with most of that NDF coming from forage. And then a higher NDF diet, so higher corn silage with 26% starch. And what they found was that in either case, BMR corn silage allowed cows to eat more total feed. And let's just drop down to fat-corrected milk. When cows were fed BMR corn silage, they produced more fat-corrected milk. This was especially true when we fed the low-starch diet. Okay, less true when we fed the high-starch diet. Okay, and there was the interaction here is listed as non-significant, but it was borderline. Okay, so when did you really see an effect of BMR corn silage? When you fed a low-starch diet. Once you got to a high-starch diet, it wasn't quite as beneficial. Another way to look at this is if you use control corn silage, well, now you really need to make sure that you are feeding minimum silage, minimum NDF, and high starch in peak lactation. If you use BMR corn silage, you can use more BMR corn silage and it doesn't make much difference. One value of feeding more BMR corn silage or digestible fiber as opposed to starch is you see less body weight gain. This is useful for cows in late lactation. Okay, so the thing I was interested in when I first heard about short corn from DeKalb agronomists is that it seemed like it was more digestible. The forage NDF was more digestible than conventional hybrids. And perhaps even as good as BMR, maybe not. And also that the yields could be as high as conventional corn silages. So for me, the question was, is short corn a cost-effective alternative for making silage for dairy cattle? We did a study where we had 5 hybrids. 3 were short corn varieties from Bayer. 1 was a tall corn variety that was DeKalb, and then 1 was a Pioneer BMR corn silage. I think my Pioneer friends will say that's not the best BMR that's out there, but anyway, that's what we used in this study. I had the BMR in there kind of as a positive control, thinking it would have the highest fiber digestibility. Cows that were limited by gut fill would be able to eat more of that and produce more milk. Tall would be the least, that would be the negative control. And then we'd see where did the shortfalls out, short corn silages fall into that. Okay, we did, there were 5 plots. I wasn't really involved with planting the corn. Perhaps I should have been more involved. I've been told that maybe we shouldn't have had just 5 plots. Maybe we should have had alternating rows throughout this field. But I will say that this was a relatively small field, maybe 30, 40 acres. And we used 5.4 acres for each hybrid. So the field was mostly marlette fine sandy loam soils with a 2 to 6% grade. There were occasional spots that were once probably wet lands or wet fields, but just small areas, and the field was tiled. And we did this in a very dry year. This was a field that had been heavily fertilized with cow manure for years, because right over here is the MSU dairy. You can't see it on the slide. Okay, during this was in 2023 was an especially dry year. Fortunately, we had great germination, and the corn looked great despite the very dry spring. Each hybrid was planted at 35,000 seeds per acre. Seeds grew well for a dry year. corn was sprayed with broadleaf herbicide on June 28 and a fungicide on August 8. I should have written on here, I think these are all 108, 109-day hybrids. The short varieties were harvested on September 21, the other two on September 22. They were all harvested into separate bags. Each bag was packed and mixed with an inoculation of VitaPlus titanium. In December, samples were taken from the front and at 2 20-foot intervals on the sides of each bag sent to Cumberland Valley. And samples within a hybrid were consistent with the CV less than 3% for NDF and CP. So what did we get for yield? Well, the tall corn silage had 8.7 tons per acre. BMR 7.6, so that was kind of what we would have expected. And then the shorts were anything from 7.5 up to 9.3. All of the corn was harvested at a pretty low cut, which was standard for Michigan State University's corn silage harvesting group. Okay, we didn't do anything special for this corn, but we harvested relatively low. Our chopper does have a kernel processor. Okay, the NDF content of all of the corn silage was reasonably consistent, 33 to 37% crude protein, 7 to 8% starch. All of them were 40% except for one of the shorts was 35. The pH was good. The starch, based on starch yield, I predicted grain yield. Anyway, the silages were all looked like they were in good quality. We did test for mycotoxins at one point, and there were probably a few more mycotoxins than we would prefer, but there weren't any big differences between the hybrids, and it did not seem to affect intake. Okay. Lignin was 7.3% of the NDF in the tall hybrid, 5.9 for BMR, and then the shorts were intermediate. 30-hour in vitro NDF digestibility, 56 for the tall, 65 for the BMR, and the shorts were halfway between. NDF digestibility, we also did in vitro NDF digestibility at different time points. I don't really think there's much to say here. The shorts were mostly intermediate between the tall and the BMR. Yeah. We also did in situ NDF digestibility. That was done at Cumberland Valley. And the shorts actually had a higher in situ NDF digestibility, at least the short one better than BMR. Short two is similar to BMR. They were all higher than the conventional, at least at 48 hours. Okay, we didn't do 30 hours, but at 24 there wasn't much difference. And then finally, we did do in vivo total tract digestibility during our first study, and there were no differences between them. But that's not surprising. When Mike Allen did his BMR work, what we would see with NDF total tract digestibility in the animal was often not all that different. Okay, so we did two studies. In study one, what we wanted to determine if one of the three short corns was superior. And in study two, we wanted to take that superior short hybrid and then compare it to the conventional. Okay, in study one, we had 40 Holstein cows, 20 primiparous, 40 multiparous. They were about 150 days in milk, producing 35 kilos of milk, or about not quite 80 pounds per cow per day, 670 kilos on average. That was the average of the primies and the multis. And I should say that so these cows were later in lactation than we would have preferred. But this was 2 years ago. We have 200 lactating cows in our herd at that time, and I had to compete with Barry Bradford and Adam Locke for cows. I simply couldn't get the early lactation cows I wanted. What I did for this study was I fed them more forage NDF than I would typically feed the cows at 150 days in milk. And I did that because I wanted to try to make sure these cows were limited by gut fill. So when I put them on our pre-diet, they actually took a hit in milk yield. I think milk yield dropped about 4 or 5 pounds when I put them on my diet. So before they were on at 35 kilos, they would have been about 37 kilos. They were blocked by parity. Treatments were assigned randomly within a block. And then we did an incomplete Latin square design with 3 periods of 3 weeks each. And they were mostly balanced for carryover effects, but not entirely because we had 3 periods. Milk and feed were measured daily. Body weight was measured 3 days at the beginning and end of each period. Condition scores were also measured then. Milk composition was analyzed for 2 days per week, all 3 milkings, 2 days per week. Samples of all diet ingredients and TMRs were collected once daily, and then orts and feces were collected to do a digestibility study every 15 hours over the last 5 days of period 2. Okay, so our diets in study 1 were, we fed a diet, I'll just say that was, I'm going to drop down here first. Forage NDF was about 24%. Okay, so whenever you do a corn silage study or forage study, you have to decide, do we feed all of our diets so that they have the same amount of corn silage or so that they have the same amount of corn silage NDF? And I chose to try to get the same amount of corn silage NDF. We weren't perfect at it because we had our samples before the study started, and then we took samples during the study and afterwards. And based on what was actually fed during the study, we decided, we weren't perfect. There was a bit more forage NDF in short 1 and BMR than there was in, I see that this, I'm sorry, that last one is 23.7, not 0.7. But we were close. So in these diets, alfalfa silage was 10%, soybean meal about 14%, soy hulls about 5%, corn grain about 0 to 8%, and then a protein mineral vitamin supplement about 12%. So I adjusted soy hulls, corn grain, and corn silage and soybean meal to try to get NDF, forage NDF, crude protein, and starch all as close together as I could. Weren't perfect, but we were close. I could point out that short 1 would have had more starch from a slower fermenting source because there was more dry corn in that diet than corn silage corn. And again, I'm sorry, this number is 23.7, not 0.7. For statistics, we did a model. Our model included diet parity. Days in milk was a covariate. And we looked at a number of interactions. We did orthogonal contrasts for our diet component of the study. We wanted to look at BMR versus other hybrids, tall versus shorts, short 1 versus the average of short 2 and short 3, and then short 2 versus short 3. And we chose short 1 versus short 2 and 3 after the fact, simply because we could see it had a different starch content and was different than short 2 and short 3. I don't feel like I am quite privy to give out the actual hybrid numbers. That's Bayer's information. Hopefully they will be willing to share them at some time. This paper is published in the Journal of Dairy Science Communications, so JDS Communications. There's more information in there. And actually we did different contrasts for the paper that I'm going to show you today. Okay, so for results, a lot of data on here. I chose to put everything on one slide so that you could kind of look through it as you want, and we could look at the whole thing. But I will take you through it step by step. So when it comes to intake, okay, BMR cows actually ate less, which was completely not what we expected. Okay, in fact, let me just handle BMR first. BMR did not behave the way we expected in this study. Perhaps we didn't have the best BMR hybrid here. Dry matter intake was lower. The cows produced less energy-corrected milk. They produced, so they produced less. They were more feed efficient, however. Okay, so they had greater feed efficiency, consistent with their greater NDF digestibility. Why they didn't eat more, I really don't understand. I suppose I don't want to dwell on the comparison of BMR versus the others too much. I do want to look at tall versus shorts. Okay, so the tall was a dekalb hybrid, and now we're looking at all stuff from Bayer. So we had a conventional hybrid, only one, okay? And all of these shorts, they were all grown in one plot. So I realize there's criticisms you could make there, but the field was pretty consistent, about as consistent as you could be. So when we look at intake, not much different. I'm going to look at tall versus the average of the shorts. However, short one ate more than the other two shorts. When we look at energy-corrected milk, in general, the shorts on average tended to produce more than the tall, and short one produced more than short two or short three. Not a big difference in fat content. The shorts generally had a little lower fat. Perhaps that might be because the NDF was more digestible. Okay, I'm not sure. Maybe there was something different about the starch. I don't know. Protein content was not really different. A little bit higher for short one than short two or short three. Feed efficiency. Not much difference between the talls and the short, but it was lower for short one than short two or short three, and not much difference in body weight gain or body condition score. Body weight actually would be the average of the period here, not just the ending body weight of a period. I guess I already showed total tract nutrient digestibilities. I'll just point out some of this doesn't entirely make sense to me, but it's what we found, okay? Organic matter digestibility was lower for BMR than tall. I have no idea why. I'm sorry, this is total tract nutrient digestibility. I really can't explain that though. And then as I already mentioned, NDF digestibility wasn't really different between the groups. Starch digestibility was slightly different. But frankly, if you're 98 versus 99%, I really don't care. And this was all the corn silage had a kernel processor. Crude protein digestibility, there were some slight differences too. Anyway, that's total tract digestibility. And our conclusion, our summary from that study was BMR improved feed efficiency, but decreased feed intake and milk production. Perhaps we didn't have the best BMR hybrid. Short hybrids increased intake on average and milk production, energy-corrected milk, relative to the tall corn, but did not alter feed efficiency. Short one had greater intake and milk production than short two and three, but lower feed efficiency, and then short two and three were similar. And we concluded that short one seemed to be the best based on dry matter yield. It had a higher yield than the other two and results of study one. So then we did a second study where we compared the conventional hybrid versus short one. 40 Holstein cows again, 20 primiparis, 20 multiparis. This time they were 76 days in milk at the start of the study, producing on average 46 kilos of milk. That's the average of the primies and the multips. So the multips were closer to 50 at least, 52. Block by parity, diets were randomly assigned within block. And this time we fed a common diet for 2 weeks as a preliminary period. And then all the cows were put on one diet for the following 6 weeks. Okay, so those 4 diets are going to vary in corn silage type and NDF content or starch content. Milk and feed were measured daily. Again, cows are milked 3 times per week. 3 times per day. Diets were fed 1 time per day as a TMR ad libitum at 110% of expected intake. Body weight and condition scores were measured at the start of the study, 3 and at 6 weeks. Milk composition analyzed 2 days per week, all 3 milkings. Samples of all diets and TMRs were collected once weekly, and then we did do digestibility in this study too. And then we also measured methane using a green feed unit. Okay, fixed effects in this study were hybrid, starch level, parity class, multiparous versus primiparous, and then the interactions, random effects, cow nested within block and hybrid, block and fiber content, and block nested within parity. And dry matter intake at the start of the study, and the pre-treatment covariate value for any particular variable were used as covariates. And all the results you'll see are LS means, so adjusted for those covariates. Okay, just a reminder, this is the composition of the 2 silages we used. And the tall and the short one were really pretty consistent. Okay, starch content, 35%. Lignin content, a little lower for short one. In vitro forage NDF digestibility was a little higher for short one. NDF content was about the same. And now we fed 4 diets. So we fed either a diet that was high starch, 36% starch, or, that's corn silage, or high starch was, where are we at? 32% starch versus low starch, 23% starch. So the high starch diet for the shorts was 36% corn silage, along with some alfalfa haylage, corn grain, soybean meal, some cottonseed, and protein mineral vitamin premix. Very, very similar for the tall high starch diet. Needed just a little bit more soy, a little less corn grain, a little more corn silage to try to get all the values below the same. And then the low starch diet, we used 56% corn silage, 14% haylage. So we were pushing these cows for peak lactation. This diet had 24% forage NDF. So it was a very high forage NDF, low starch diet for cows in peak lactation, especially in Michigan. We would never feed this diet to cows in peak lactation. It's got way more forage. So we're really pushing the diets to say, okay, would forage NDF digestibility potentially make a difference? Here are results, and I'd like to especially highlight a few things here, and those are the things in yellow. Okay, so when we fed the short versus the tall on a high starch diet, intake was the same. But when we fed the low starch diet, when we really pushed the cows to say, okay, how much can you eat when we're feeding you lots of forage NDF, the cows on the short corn silage ate more than those on the tall or conventional corn silage, and that was significant. And then, of course, on average, cows consuming high starch ate more than cows consuming low starch. That was to be expected. That's normally what you see, and that's why we typically feed high starch diets to cows in peak lactation. Then if we look at energy-corrected milk, here, feeding higher starch tended, I should be careful, it's P equals 0.3, tended to increase energy-corrected milk. It certainly increased total milk, but it tended to, or it actually significantly decreased milk fat percent while increasing total milk. So feeding more starch tended, I'm going to use that word loosely here, to increase energy-corrected milk. Not a lot. But hybrid did make a difference. So feeding the short corn silages increased energy-corrected milk compared to feeding the tall corn silages. That was true whether we fed high starch, 45.2 versus 43.3, or low starch, 44.1 versus 42.5. So this is in kilograms. If you want to think about pounds, that would be about 100 pounds and a difference of about 4 pounds. Okay, so got about 4% more milk from the cow, energy-corrected milk from the cows when we fed the short corn versus the tall corn. Recognizing they ate more too. And I realize, yeah, feed efficiency is down here. No difference between hybrids. Certainly feed efficiency was greater for the low starch diets. And that's, we measure body weight gain. This is looking at milk over intake. If we incorporated body weight gain into this, and I tried to put in what I think happened to energy, the energetic efficiency wouldn't be much different between the high and low starch diets. Okay, so I think that's probably all I really want to point out here. So just to reiterate, the short corn diets resulted in more milk production, energy-corrected milk production, than the tall corn diets, and that was true whether you fed high or low starch. Just quickly, we really didn't see much effect on methane from hybrids, but we did see what we expected, that with higher starch, you get less methane per unit of intake. So summary and conclusion from study 2, as expected, high starch diets increased intake, milk yield, milk protein content, and yield, body weight gain and body condition gain, but decreased milk fat content. The short hybrid increased intake, energy-corrected milk yield, and milk protein content and yield. There was no interaction between the hybrid and starch level. And as expected, high starch diets decreased methane. Hybrid had no effect. So our conclusion was that, at least in this study, the short one hybrid outperformed the tall control as a forage corn for cows in peak lactation. I did not try to do economics on this. I would point out, however, that in this particular study, the short corn had just as great of a yield, in fact, slightly higher than the tall corn silage. And I recognize that this was, this was 1 year. This was one field. Each was only one plot. There was one bag of short corn, one bag of tall corn. You could argue that that's not really replicated, but there is no way to do a good corn silage study. And I just say the perfect study for corn silage is just about impossible. To really do a corn silage study right, okay, you'd have to have small plots of each hybrid, each stored in a separate bag. Now you'd have to be feeding 5 different bags of each hybrid every day. That means I got to make up a separate diet for each one of these. Maybe I'd feed each one of them to 4 cows. And then I'd have to decide, do I feed equal amounts of corn silage? Do I have equal forage NDF, equal starch? I would have to feed just about 30 or 40 different diets if I really want to do a corn silage study correctly. And then I'd want to look at exactly what's going on with body weight gain. So I'd need to do this for a long time. It's impossible to do. I'd also point out that when you think about what does this mean for my farm, well, this is not, there's not a perfect, in my opinion, a perfect corn silage for all farms. It depends on what other feeds are available. Okay. Do you have plenty of land to grow all of your own corn grain? Or is land a limitation? Do you have other non-forage fiber sources available? Can you get cotton seeds or soy hulls or beet pulp or corn gluten feed? Are those things you can get in pretty cheap? Because if you can, well, then maybe I'm going to worry less about fiber digestibility in my corn silage. I recently did a study where we fed 8% wheat straw and only 25% corn silage, no other forage in our diet. And then I fed a bunch of non-forage fiber sources, and we got 52 kilos of milk from cows that the control group fed as the best diet I could feed, and with lots of starch and digestible NDF. Forage NDF was 53 kilos. So I lost maybe 2 pounds of milk feeding other stuff, not grown on the farm. Is minimizing off-farm feed costs a goal? Is wind a concern? If you're worried, in Michigan, wind is not our top concern. It's not like I grew up in Iowa and it can be windy, especially in the northwestern part. Okay, then short corns might offer a real advantage. So I would just point out that, no silage is probably perfect for everything. I think I could deal with whatever corn silage you give me, and I could get close to maximum milk from cows. But I would still love to feed digestible fiber to cows in early and late lactation. I still think forage corns that have more digestible fiber, especially if I want to grow as much stuff on my own farm as I can, is an advantage. In our hands, the short corn had higher forage NDF digestibility. I've seen other studies where the forage NDF digestibility was in vitro NDF digestibility from the feed lab was greater than it was for conventional hybrids that were compared to it. But I know there's probably studies that show big differences in conventionals. So, this is just what we found. I'd also point out that I know that there are other hybrids. Really what's different about the short corn is it has more leaves per unit stalk. You could probably cut higher. You could maybe find a forage corn that's got more leaves per stalk too. I don't know. But one of the big advantages of the short corn is it handles wind better. And if you can get as much yield as you can from conventional, it seems like it's worth a try. So that would be my conclusion, at least based on our study. With that, I'm happy to take some questions.
Well, thanks, Mike. And we might have to have you back on to share your next study coming up in here shortly. But before we get started with the Q&A portion, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. ReaShure Precision-Release Choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. So Mike, we got a lot of questions coming in. So your first question is from Tashomi. What is the association between high NDF, gas production, and milk yield?
So I've never paid a lot of attention to gas yield, okay? But I would imagine that if gas yield is some indication of fiber digestibility, that it's the same thing. So I'm not an expert on gas yield. So I really prefer not to even get into that one. Okay. But
Okay. We'll
I
table
see,
that one.
I see one question from Jim Aldrich that I'm looking at the Q&A here too.
Yep.
That I wanted just quick answer because he asked what's 0.7 ECM, and I should have said that. ECM, energy corrected milk, is something people have been doing for years, and we use this equation that, in my opinion, makes no sense. Years ago, Lou Armentano and I said, why don't we calculate milk energy? Why don't we talk about whether we're doing 4% fat corrected milk or 3.5% fat corrected milk? Why don't we just say we're assuming that the milk energy unit is that there's 0.7 megacals of energy per kilo of milk. So I just take my milk energy divided by 0.7. That's 0.7 ECM. Okay, I'll let you moderate.
No, you're good. If you see another question come in that you definitely want to answer, jump right in. But I do have a question myself when I was listening to the study diets. So you added quite a bit more dry corn to short one. Does that mean that it delivered less corn grain in the silage by quite a bit?
All of the corn silages were 40% starch.
Mm-hmm.
Short one was only 35%. Okay. And, I chose it because the fiber seems more digestible. I recognize, and I should have showed this on the second study. I recognize that difference in starch might have contributed to the results because we included a bunch of starch that would have been more slowly fermented. However, I just point out that for all of those studies, we were feeding more forage NDF than I would typically feed to cows at that point in time. So I don't think that the starch fermentation rate in those diets probably was a big contributor to differences in what we found for results. And I'd point out in the second study, there were slight differences there too. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the effects on intake in milk, the differences between hybrids, I had 23% starch, I think, in one diet, and was it 32% starch in the other? The difference you saw with that massive difference in starch was actually less, I think, than the difference we saw due to hybrid. So I don't think I think there's something going on that it's not, you can't explain this based on starch content or starch fermentation profiles.
Okay. Josh is asking, how would you expect the results to look in early lactation versus mid? Any differences?
By early lactation, I'm not sure what he means. So if you mean fresh, mm-hmm. Well, for fresh cows, I'm perfectly fine feeding conventional corn silage. Fiber digestibility is not the important point there. I think Mike Ellen has shown quite nicely that in fact we don't want too much propionate hitting the liver right away in fresh cows, but otherwise, I would say, our study started at 70 days. I think at 40 days, we'd see the same kind of results.
Josh is asking, did you observe any differences by parity in terms of dry matter intake or milk yield between tall or short?
No parity by treatment interaction. So I did not even report that. So no parity by treatment, parity by diet interactions at all. So premies acted just the same way as multips.
Daryl is asking, in the second study, you only saw about 1.8 to 2.4 pounds more energy-corrected milk when feeding diets, about 9% higher in starch, a very large diet change.
That was kilos.
Okay.
Not pounds. So about 3-4 pounds. I agree. Not as big as I would have expected.
Yeah.
But one of the things that happens is, I'll look at my paper. We did see more body weight gain from the high starch diets too. Okay. So, and then the other thing I'd say is, measuring body weight gain, and that was significant, but measuring body weight gain in 6 weeks still, we can do it, and it was significant, but I suspect there might even been a bigger difference than what we thought, based on other work we've done.
Okay.
Did I answer the whole question there?
Yeah, I think so. It says there are many published studies that show 5 to 8 pounds more energy corrected milk from eating a couple grams of feed additive. How is that possible?
Yeah. So what was my difference was, 1 point, about 2 to 3 pounds more energy corrected milk, which would be same as fat corrected milk, very similar. When you look at just milk, okay, we saw an extra 3 kilos with the tall hybrid, so 7 pounds of milk. If you just look at milk, not the energy correction.
Next question comes from Manfred, and it says, excellent talk. Thank you. You planted about 9 plants per meter squared. Are the short hybrids more tolerant to planting at higher densities?
I can't answer that. I'm not an agronomist, so I really don't know. I see a question from Paul Dyke too. He said, was the population of the short corn that was planted 38, 34, 30? They were all 35,000.
Mm-hmm.
So they were all planted the same, 35,000. And we used the same silage in study 2 as in study 1.
Okay.
I'm just looking at, I think I said 35,000 on there, didn't I? Yeah.
I know it was in your slides.
I think it was 35,000.
And the slides are available to download in the handouts tab, and they will be available for anyone that's still looking for them. They will be available when we put the video out as well. So
I'm going to go back and look. Yeah, all of them were 35,000 plants per acre.
Yep.
I don't know what that is per meter squared. Can't do that one in my head.
Okay. And
actually, wait a minute. 80,000 per hectare. So what is that? 8? I think that's 8 per meter squared. I have no idea what would happen if it was more dense. Maybe somebody from Bayer's on here and they can answer that question.
There you go.
Somebody from Pioneer. I know a few of my friends from Pioneer were going to be on here, so I suspect Bayer folks are too.
So Alan is asking, were there any other particle size differences between the different corn silages that were fed? In other words, did the short corn chop differently?
I don't remember, and I don't think so, but I don't remember anymore. And I don't have that in front of me.
Let's see. Vital is asking, is there an efficient way to test these hybrids on farm when making multiple piles? Is not possible.
Yeah, good question. So, I do think that so if I was going to try this, if I had a dairy and I wanted to try, so my conclusion really is, I think the short corns are worth trying. But you'd want to find one that had good yield. I'd want to know what is the expected yield compared to tall. I'm willing to give up some on yield if I can expect the in vitro digestibility, forage NDF digestibility to be greater. So I would take a sample, even fresh would be better than nothing, I suppose, and have it tested and see if there's any difference. We did, I think Paul Dyke just said, did we do 7-hour start to digestibility? I believe we did, and I believe we saw no difference or pretty small difference.
Okay. Alan is also asking, do you think that chemical fiber digestibility alone accounts for the differences observed?
I have no idea. Good question. I don't know if there's something else about fragility of, the plant cell walls that might be important here. Certainly could be, but I just don't know. Lignin was lower in the short corns than in the tall corn. Maybe that's because there were more leaves per unit stem. I don't know. I didn't try to assess that. Probably we should have, but I don't think, like an agronomist, I probably should have done that, and I didn't.
Jeff is asking, is the high starch versus low starch in the high starch versus low starch trial? I believe you said they were acclimated to the high starch diet before the start of the trial. Did the low starch cows go directly onto the low starch diet, or was there a trend? And was there a trend in response to the low starch diets over time?
Okay, so what we did was all the cows were fed a diet that was 50-50 of everything. I'm sorry, 25 to 1/4 of everything. So we took a blend of all 4 diets, and that's what was fed for the preliminary period. So they would have gone from a diet that was about 26% starch up to, or 27% starch up to 32% starch. And our 32% starch did have 17% forage NDF. So that's a little lower than you would sometimes feed. So we probably pushed them a little bit on that, which could be why we saw a drop in. That probably explains why we saw a drop in milk fat, and why energy corrected milk wasn't increased perhaps as much as it might otherwise have been, especially on the short hybrid.
Paul has another question.
It would be nice to have had an intermediate diet in there, maybe something that would have been 19% forage NDF, 29% starch.
Mm-hmm. Paul just had another question in here about any issues with chopping. Did you have any issues with the chopper plugging or anything like that with the short hybrids?
Not to my, I didn't hear about any of that. Okay. So I didn't specifically ask, I should have, but I would have thought that I would have heard something. I did ride in the chopper while he was doing the short corn for a little while, and it certainly didn't plug while I was riding in it. I know I've heard that some people say you got to cut the short hybrids, closer to the ground. We just did the folks chopping ours chopped it, to my knowledge, the way they chop all of our corn silage at MSU. For the past 10 years, we've grown mostly BMR for our dairy herd. We grow a little bit of conventional corn silage for cows, for fresh cows and dry cows, but we've done mostly BMR, and so we chop it the same way we chop that.
Now, I know you said you didn't do much from an economics standpoint, but your gut, what would you say as far as the economics of feeding a short versus a BMR versus a tall?
Well, in our study, it would have been, I think, probably positive. Okay, so we had more tonnage from the short that we used in the second study than we did from the tall. And the fiber was more digestible. The cows produced more. They did eat a little bit more, but, feed is pretty cheap compared to the value of milk. So especially when milk production is high, I think the economics would have been good for the short in our case, unless, of course, I had to pay way more for the seed. Perhaps that would have been another thing that would start to even them out. But that's my gut. But, I haven't penciled it out.
Yeah. Well, and we have reached the top of the hour. So I'll end it here and say thank you, Mike, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you do have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com.
Thanks for listening, and I hope I didn't make any of my Bayer Pioneer friends too unhappy with me. I'm just trying to tell you what we saw in this particular case, and it seemed like it was a good choice. So
Excellent. Well, the Real Science Lecture Series will continue with educational topics each month, including our next two. On November 18th, join Balchem's Scott Sorrell and Walt Cooley from Progressive Dairy Publications as we chat with dairy producer Greg Nye of Mountain View Dairy on the next Real Producer Exchange. And on December 2nd, we'll have a Global Dairy Market Status and 2035 Perspectives webinar with Philip Getz of IFCN Dairy. Visit balchem.com/realscience for details on other future webinars and to register for these upcoming events. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Log on to your favorite podcast platform and search for Real Science Exchange or visit balchem.com/podcast. If you want a cool Real Science Exchange t-shirt, just subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address to anh.marketing@balchem.com, and we'll get that right off to you. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. VandeHaar, thank you for joining us today.
Bye-bye.